Okay. Frank, do you want to,
Yeah, if you have Mark put up the, Mark, you can go ahead, I guess, and just share the screen. I'll start with the intro slides. And, well, okay, just as an introduction, I'm just going to introduce this, and then you'll hear from two people, from Jonathan Martin, who I think most of you know, and you may not have met Mark, except at our very first meeting. And then Mark Evans is going to go through the details of the form-based code, and which is why he's part of our team from the beginning. So with that, Mark, go ahead.
Okay, I think this is you.
Yes, I'll go through the first 4 or 5 of these, and just so that everyone is, I think all of you have this, but what we're trying to do here is with the tutorial, also we'll try to follow it up and based on your comments and ideas tonight, and we're hoping, we had asked the manager and if we could have a second meeting with you all, with the trustee on zoning. And I think that they're looking at dates for that and may have a date. So we're hoping that the draft zoning that we're asked to do can stay within this timeline and be in sync with the comprehensive plan. So that's the main thing to say here about it. So the next slide just goes through the basic, just as a basic introduction to this. When we started, we had talked to Stuart and then the manager and then Jaime as your planner. And we've divided the zoning effort sort of into 2 different groups. One is code maintenance, housekeeping issues within the code, some of which are very important, like definitions in the code, consistency of one part of the code to another, and village council and the building department and Jaime Martinez are going to take the lead on that. But issues related to the comprehensive plan, addressing issues that have been raised in the plan, this is one of them, as well as the waterfront. So downtown and the T district are things that we'll be doing. So tonight we'll stress just the, basically the downtown, and we have added also the Croton Avenue area. So that's the distinction between the two. Jonathan is working now on amendments to the T district with Jaime, and also a new district idea we've had, a contextual sort of district for infill housing and townhouse development, which was suggested to us in site visits we took with the manager and with Karen and Jaime. So the idea of this MF3 district, it will fit right into your code, and it could be mapped after adoption of the comprehensive plan, but it will simply give the trustees another option for what we call the missing middle, or planners tend to call it that. That is a zone a little bit between the T-zone and some of your existing multifamily homes, multifamily zones in the code. But at any rate, those 2 will come separately through Jaime and Stuart. But tonight's idea is to just go through the form-based code downtown and for Croton Avenue. So Mark, you can go ahead to the next slide. And I just wanted to mention that the form-based code, we're very cognizant of work that we regard pretty highly, and I think the village does. And that was 2011 work by Steve Tilley and company on design guidelines. We think that this form-based code and Steve Tilley's work can work complementary to each other. And so that the planning board would still be able to use Steve Tilley's work and at the same time use the form-based work. And then also we're looking at, of course, the recommendations out of the Downtown Redevelopment Working Committee on different form-based. form-based zoning. So with that, go ahead to the next, Mark, the next slide. I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Jonathan, who will now get into, the basics of the form-based code.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to go through a few slides before we get into some specific details led by Mark, but I thought we might begin by defining what a form-based code is. And it's a relatively new type of zoning. It's been around for about 38 years, 39 years, but really about well over 90% of what's been adopted in the country has occurred since 2001, and it's a type of zoning that really focuses on the built results and makes those more predictable and a high quality public realm. And it does so by emphasizing or regulating building form and so typical separation of uses. And it uses the physical form and the building's relationship to the street and the public realm as an organizing principle. And if you think about it, it really makes a lot of sense because you're interested in a variety of, elements about zoning, certainly density, height, setbacks, these kinds of things. But if you use a form-based code, you actually prescribe how a building relates to its context and to its street. And so these are often guided by existing conditions in the community. So, analyses are done, and Mark will share some of these. We'll talk about them tonight, about arsoning. Trying to tap into, the good things in terms of the built environment, the positive aspects that exist, and writing a code that sort of replicates that. We also have established design guidelines. So Frank just mentioned Steve Tilley's work, which, by the way, I think those guidelines are terrific. I've spent a lot of time, and I know Mark looked at them as we developed some of the ideas that we're going to present tonight. And then, of course, that careful examination of the existing context. The focus is on built form or building form, frontages and storefronts, that relation to the street and the public realm, and a serious emphasis on the location of parking. And that's, something that often has to get dealt with in other review processes. In a form-based code, it's sort of baked in, if you will. It creates a more predictable environment for private investment. And so sort of the idea here is that you want to write a code that allows the developers to do what they do best, but produce the buildings that the village is going to sort of cherish, and it's going to contribute positively to the built environment. If we could go to the next slide. So here is just a very light comparison between the two types of zoning that we have.
Oh,
really.
Sure, just to mix it up.
The
It's not easy ordering a cocktail from the world's worst
Bob,
waitresses.
can you mute yourself?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So, the typical zoning is called Euclidean zoning, and it has a focus on use. So really it came out of this idea of separating uses. Design is secondary, and it's often handled in a separate process. And that's indeed why, back in 2011, after the 2009 plan, there was this call to create those design guidelines. So we had a guidebook guide to inform developers on the kinds of things that the Architectural Review Board, the Planning Board, and indeed the community was expecting. That focus is really in Euclidean zoning on internal lot parameters. So if you look at, most of the zoning in the country, and indeed your village code right now, if you look at it, it will tell you a lot of what you have to do on your site. In fact, it doesn't even reference the outside at all. And so the focus here is usually setbacks, yard widths, minimum height or a maximum height, minimum yards, allowable density, and things like this. A pure form-based code, on the other hand, doesn't really focus on use at all. It really focuses on the built form. And in its purest form, it believes that the market knows best. And we don't, if I was to say, well, let's adopt this pure form-based code, we wouldn't care so much or really at all about what the use is. And so you can imagine that has some challenges with it as well. And that regulation in form-based code, pure form-based code, is really on the building street relationship. And I think this is the most positive aspect of form-based codes. It really, directs buildings to become sort of the best citizens they can in terms of contributing to the overall context, the built form. And that's a very positive thing. The way a lot of people are going these days, and in fact, the way BFJ planning has approached this prior, is through a hybrid approach, which takes some of the best and the strengths of the Euclidean zoning and some of the strengths of the form-based codes. And so what we will talk about is a hybrid approach this evening. If we could go to the next slide. So 3 key concepts that are integrated or can be integrated very easily with form-based codes. These work well with a hybrid approach, and that is doing an overlay. And an overlay zone is a special district that's created, and it places over the existing zoning. So the existing zoning stays in place, but the overlay identifies some special provisions in addition to, or instead of those underlying the base zone. Overlay zoning has been around for a long time. It works very well, and it accomplishes something else that is not in this definition. It allows existing property owners to continue as they are. And they can opt into the new zoning they like. If not, they can stay. That's very different than going in and saying, change the whole zoning here, because then you end up with a lot of non-conforming uses or buildings or whatever it might be. So this hybrid overlay approach is very efficient. Incentive zoning is a tool that allows new development in certain areas, wherever you specify, to voluntarily achieve some extra floor area or some other specified benefits that provide public benefits identified in the code. And incentive zoning is used to ensure that new development contributes, for example, to infrastructure investments where needed, or the provision of civic space or whatever it might be that is defined by the community. Often incentive zoning and overlay zoning, these can be tied to a community benefit fund. And that's a fee imposed by the zoning code, really, or the local government, to ask new development to help pay the way for the costs of providing public services that are associated with that development. It's often implemented as part of that incentive zoning framework. It can be tied also with an overlay and the form-based. And so we've sort of got these sort of 4 elements that are working together here. We've got a form-based code, we've got an overlay idea, we've got this idea of incentive, and that's how you opt in. If you opt into the overlay and the form-based, you get an incentive. And then this idea that there can be a fee imposed for to pay for provisions that the community auctioning is interested in. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the very approach that I've just spoken about, I'm going to talk about very quickly 2 local examples. One is a smaller village, and the other is the city of New Rochelle. And even though the internal parameters are a little bit different between these 2, you would expect one is a village, one is a fast-growing city. But the principles are the same. So if we take a look at this, they both specify or target key areas. They both work through this overlay concept. They're both hybrids, meaning that they regulate form and use. So this hybrid approach is very efficient, as I said, and they both include incentives. So in the village of Mount Kisco, this was some additional floor area. This was the ability in a particular area to do residential use that the underlying zoning didn't permit at the time. And, you know, slightly more height to make all of this work as part of that incentive. In New Rochelle, the incentives are floor area bonuses, and they're quite dramatic. As you know, they have some very tall and even taller buildings going up in New Rochelle at this point. Not the context we're talking about tonight for Ossining, but this idea of an incentive that encourages, incentivizes developers to opt in and do what you guys want them to do. The city of New Rochelle also has a mitigation fee or a community benefit fund, as we called it before. And that's requires the developer to contribute, in this instance, to infrastructure and community facilities funds, parking and so forth like this to help pay for the expected impacts of this new development, especially that associated with the floor area bonus. So we can go to the next slide. And Mark, do you want to pick this up here?
I think you were going to just cover these next two.
I was a little confused.
Straight off. Yep.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
So we're going to talk a little bit more now about the details on the ground of the two areas that we looked at for this. And the next two slides, this one and the following, are going to show at least a graphic form of some of the analysis that we did to inform you know, what Mark's going to talk about in a moment. This is
Jonathan, if
yes?
you don't mind, just for the trustees or those who are going on the site visit, I was just thinking about this. We've made color copies of these, so our site visit Saturday morning, whoever comes, you're all getting a copy of these two maps that Jonathan describes.
That's great. Thanks, Frank. Yep, that will be the case. So I'm not going to read this. You'll be able to read this Saturday, but you can see this is the downtown and really the village center district. And some of the analyses we did here was look at the characteristics of the type of frontages. And, you know, I've labeled here, you know, more complete or stronger frontages and less strong, or, you know, I wouldn't say weaker, but less strong frontages in terms of creating this strong, healthy downtown, walkable, pedestrian environment. We also have identified some key parcels, those owned by the village, thinking about, you know, the possibility of what they might be, and also looking at very carefully, in some instances, if right where Mark's on Academy Street, that corner of Academy and State, looking very carefully as an example at some of the buildings and their relationships to the streets. Overall here, what this analysis is looking at is, or searching for, is for good positive precedents, and also areas that, you know, from an urban design perspective and from a form-based code, a zoning perspective, areas that, you know, could be strengthened, could be treated a little bit differently, could be adjusted in terms of the parameters to make them more healthy and appropriate for private investment, and ultimately all contributing to sort of a complete, you know, cohesive built environment with a lot of focus on the different types of frontages. If we go to the next slide.
Jonathan, just one thing I want to just drop in here that I think key elements would be to say that these green colors highlight areas where the frontage, the area, the buildings and storefronts facing those streets, in this case Main Street and portions of Spring Street, are more complete. And there's other areas where they are less complete, where there may be a parking lot interrupting in between a building or things like that that may kind of break up the continuity of the street experience. And so I just thought those two colors, it's a little hard to see the text here, but I think the two colors sort of highlight areas where we've been focusing on the strong and positive examples in your community's DNA, where we've been photographing and studying what is working well and where could we focus on improvement.
Great, thanks, Mark. do you want to go to the next slide?
Yep.
Okay, so similar analysis, but this is for Croton Avenue. And this is the NC2 district here. You've got some other zoning districts that come down, but again, a similar analysis of you know, stronger frontages and weaker frontages, stronger shown in the green and the weaker one shown in the red. Now, you know, I think Manny at some point at a previous meeting when we had talked about this, asked what I meant about stronger and weaker. And really it is back to a sense of completeness and you know, holding the building street relationship together in more continuity at various points. And so if you can see along Croton Avenue down towards the CVS and the supermarket, right there, that is, you know, the supermarket has a small wall with some wrought iron fence. That's a very different experience than even right across the street, where you have a relatively new buildings, that newer 3-story building with podium parking that's shown directly above in the photo. And that, in terms of its building street relationship, is a very strong condition for a corridor, especially as it approaches closer to downtown. As you move a little further to the east, you get a little bit more of a residential feel. And that's perfectly acceptable as you come into Ossining and you start to see that. You would expect sort of this transition from something that's a little bit more loose and then getting into a little bit more density and then finally getting to your most active areas down towards downtown, and then even more so where it's a much more walkable pedestrian environment in the VC district or the downtown. So as Mark said, this is sort of part, we wanted to show you this for the part of the analysis that we've done. There's been lots of other photographs and a cataloging of the different types of frontages in terms of their use and their relationship to the street or the sidewalk itself. So if you can go to the next slide, Mark.
Because this, I'll start here. And Frank and Jonathan, thank you for the introduction. And for all of you who have not met me, I'm an architect and planner and have been focusing on downtowns and walkable communities for most of my career. And BFJ Planning and I have had the chance to work together in 3 New York State communities, focusing on form-based codes. The 2, the New Rochelle as well as Mount Kisco are the ones that I've worked on as well, and so helped co-author those codes. So I bring some experience looking at sort of integrating kind of village master planning with looking at how we can codify these in ways that make sense for creating stronger sense of place. You have a wonderful combination of buildings and some historic architecture and public spaces and street experiences that we want to make sure that we learn from. And so I think the key point here is to say that the starting point of a successful form-based code is making sure that we enhance the public realm. But to do that, you know, every community is slightly different. The scale and character of the sidewalk experience, the scale and character of the buildings, the public frontages, those areas that are between the front door and the street, each have a slightly different character. So we'll talk about those, but the key things that I believe we should be focusing on are focus more on forms than on uses. Use is important, but not the primary driver. Focus on front yards and storefronts and designating where do storefronts belong in your commercial areas and where might storefronts be inappropriate in the middle of a neighborhood. And so we want to make sure that we code for the character that's desired. You know, one of the goals is to create much more pedestrian-oriented streets and buildings that are similar in scale to nearby buildings, so that there are no you know, sort of random buildings that are 2 or 3 times the size of their neighbors, And I think all of this needs to be informed by Austening's existing character. And so you'll see in a few minutes that, each district we've looked at different examples of, buildings and streets that we should learn from. To sort of highlight where we're focusing, I thought this map would help us. This map highlights in purple your existing underlying zoning, the village center district, village commercial district, sorry, and this is a, sorry, this is not the village center, sorry, this is your neighborhood commercial NC2 district here. And so the one area that I want to just highlight, though, is the only areas that are not covered in your NC2 district are this one area here and this one area here. It seemed like they were somewhat remote from the Croton Avenue, Main Street, Spring Street experience. So the focus of this form-based overlay zone, in fact, is this area here that we're calling the downtown overlay, and this area in orange that we're calling the Croton Avenue overlay. And so these are kind of draft terms that we can amend if it makes sense to call them something slightly different. But let me just get my highlighter here. So that's the where. And then in terms of, I think you heard Jonathan talk about the role of overlays and incentives to encourage a better quality and caliber of buildings and design, is that, this concept that to opt into the overlay requires, first off, participation in the community benefit fund. And we have to work out exactly what dollar amount that might represent. But I think the key concept here is that those community benefit funds would support improvements to things like parking and civic spaces or possibly schools. You all can decide where those funds should be prioritized. But when an applicant would come in and say, hey, we're interested in opting into an overlay zone, in this case, the downtown overlay, the underlying zoning allows 4 stories and 48 feet as the maximum building height. And the underlying zoning places residential uses as a conditional use. And in these areas, residential is only permitted if there is a commercial use underneath it on the first floor. And so it's a fairly limited set of circumstances where you could have residential over commercial. And so the proposed concept here for the overlay would be that getting to sort of 5 stories and 58 feet, that additional story, and that potentially residential uses could become a permitted use. And so that's the basic concept for the village commercial area. And then the neighborhood commercial, the NC2 district allows 3 stories and 36 feet. Once again, residential or conditional use. And then the idea is that, if an applicant were to participate in this overlay, they might be eligible for 1 additional story or an additional 12 feet to bring up to 48 feet. And that residential uses might be a permitted use. And so that's the basic benefit of participating and sort of incentive to opt into this overlay if it were to become ordinance. And so before we go much further, because a lot of this we want to sort of get, sort of everybody familiar with the key terms. The terms are slightly different than a typical Euclidean zoning ordinance like most municipalities have. And so this diagram helps to I think, sort of introduce some of these concepts. The property line is here, the street, the traveled way. And just in general, the idea is that the area closer to the street where the sidewalk is located is called the public frontage. And the area within the lot where the building can be built, we call the private frontage. And then there's this, in some areas, if this was say an area on the far eastern edge of Croton Avenue, it would be appropriate to have the building wall further back. You know, maybe the typical example of a building might be 10 or 15 or 20 feet behind the property line. Whereas in the case of Main Street, the street wall, the building, you know, might be 0 feet, might be 5 feet set back from the front property line. And so we try and identify this sort of build-to zone. This, you know, could be 5 feet wide or could be 10 feet wide, where most buildings, to be good neighbors to each other and create a quality outdoor room and public realm, the form-based code says your front street wall, or at least a portion of the front of your building, should be somewhere within this zone. And so we'll talk about that a little further, but those are sort of the key terms. But, you know, and so frontage is sort of probably another key term here. And so slightly different than your zoning districts, a form-based code has a regulating plan. And the three things the colors I want you to sort of focus in on would be this solid red line, which in the case of most downtowns, we call it primary commercial street frontage. The idea, this is where the storefronts, the retail, the restaurant, it doesn't say what use is there, but it says the form of a storefront is the most typical example of the kinds of sidewalk experience you should see along a primary commercial frontage. So in this particular downtown, the solid red line here and red line here and some of the solid red lines over here show the areas where only storefronts would be allowed. Whereas when you get further away from that sort of core of this portion of Main Street and this core of this portion of Mosher Avenue, it can be a little more flexible. And so secondary commercial frontage might allow for, maybe there's an office window in the front of the street. Maybe there's certain kinds of residential frontages, but in general, it's sort of a more transitional type use. And then the third type I'll highlight here is this Greenway street frontage. This idea that, you know, in this particular community, they've got a waterway, a creek that runs through the middle of their downtown, and having landscaping and hedges and street trees and green spaces is important. You know, in your case, you have the Aqueduct Greenway that you know, that I think, you know, is part of your downtown. So we'd want a code for how to handle those situations differently than a typical commercial street. So those are the this notion of street frontages, where you're sort of setting the rules for what's the character of that street or that piece of a street. One of the goals of many downtown or village neighborhood commercial areas is to create active environments where pedestrians feel welcomed, where outdoor dining feels comfortable, where the sidewalk is gracious and large enough where people feel like they can walk along that sidewalk. You know, maybe there's some on-street parking here or some benches, but this notion that where the private frontage, you know, storefronts and windows and doors meets the sidewalk, is that kind of that's the interrelationship that makes successful commercial districts thrive and great neighborhoods feel comfortable. And so typically those are, you know, and so in the code, we may call for a certain frequency of doorways or a certain minimum percentage of glazing or windows so that they feel right. If this was an outdoor dining area, but this was, you know, 100 feet of blank wall, it wouldn't feel like people belong there, and probably there would be if there's no entrances, then there'd be no reason to go in or out or be on the sidewalk. So we want to make sure that there's at least a minimum amount of visibility in that area. A couple of the other key concepts, I think I showed them in the diagram earlier, but this notion of a build-to line, this sort of gold line right here, is that build-to line, which is usually within a few feet of the front property line. And then this build to zone, which is this area where you'll see in the case of these three buildings here, a portion of their front wall is located in that build to zone. Not all of it, but at least a minimum percentage is located there. And so in the more downtown areas like your Main Street, that build to zone, that sort of plus or minus where you want to have buildings ideally located, on Main Street, it might be 5 feet from the front property line, 0 to 5 feet. On Spring Street, it may be slightly larger, where maybe it's 5 to 10 feet. On Croton Avenue, there's a lot of variation on Croton Avenue, but it could range between 10 and 20 feet setback as to where you want to have most of the buildings be located. There will be outliers where historically some building was built further back or closer, but we're trying to set a good norm for the buildings to comply with. And these diagrams here just show you an example of how a storefront kind of comes up to that build to line and occupies most of that frontage. Here you see an example of a townhouse style building with a walk up where, you know, the building isn't all up to the street. There's a, you know, some sort of a side yard there, but that's generally what we're looking for is sort of that public.
So I wanted to ask, and I think this is just to clarify for everybody in case it's not clear. It's sort of like where we have in the current zoning, we have setback minimums. This would include a setback maximum as well. So
that is correct.
Minimum and a maximum. Yeah. Yep.
A minimum and a maximum. And it doesn't mean that every part of the building has to comply with that. This concept of frontage occupancy, uses, says, hey, at least, in your commercial district, you should have buildings, inside that zone for maybe 60% of it could be building a minimum, whereas in a typical residential street, maybe that's 40% of the front lot width. So if your lot width was 100 feet, we were saying that the building should be in that yellow build to zone. For a 100-foot wide lot, there should be 60 feet of building within that 100 feet. If this was a residential property and the lot was 100 feet wide, would say that the building should be 40 feet wide in that yellow zone. So, so it sort of sets a minimum norm. We create these outdoor rooms that we think is really a core element of what makes for a successful street, and in particular in a commercial district. If we had a storefront on this side and a storefront on this side, and then we had 100 feet of parking lot, when a customer is walking down the street and considering whether they're going to go to that next block, if there's a 100-foot parking lot where no activity, no storefront, nothing to look at, no street trees, no landscaping, just a basic parking lot, many people will turn around. And so many of the neighboring properties could be unsuccessful in getting customers because somebody was allowed to build a big parking lot in the middle of what was otherwise a thriving commercial street. So, and then the final...
I wanted to kind of follow up that statement. There's this one spot where you have Croton Avenue actually gets broken up by Walgreens, where there's sort of like it's a big interruption that happens with a huge parking lot that's set out in front that didn't necessarily need to be there, not in the front at least.
Right, and so those are the kinds of examples where we would hope to code for this in a way that the further applicants would be strongly encouraged to have some portion of the building closer to the street to help neighboring properties. But one other thing we've been talking about is parking lots, and in general, trying to get parking to be behind the buildings. This is the street here, here's the buildings, and the blue area shows parking areas behind the building. In this case here, in the form-based code, we might be encouraging or requiring the buildings to be up in the build-to zone, but we would also say pushing the parking back. And so we have yet to determine what that dimension is, but in concept, we're trying to make sure that what you see when you walk down the street are attractive buildings and storefronts, generally not parking lots. So I think now I think I will introduce a couple concepts as to how we, so our preliminary thinking as to how these form-based code principles could apply to Ossining, to the two districts. And I think we really look at this as us looking at the DNA of your community, both the architectural DNA and the urban form of your community, and making sure that we understand it and that we replicate it. And I'm not talking about copying buildings, but at least make sure the forms are similar. And so what we have done is, in coordination with Jonathan and Frank and the whole team, we've been looking at sort of studying Main Street and seeing what are the types of buildings along your Main Street and what's the typical setback. Typically the setbacks around 0 to 5 feet, what's the maximum setback? It's typically about 10 feet is the maximum setback. And so that helps us understand what might be a frontage called a storefront. We then look at a sort of slightly less intense but similar location of professional, which could be an office that might have a slightly smaller windows. Maybe there's not quite as many doors entering that office, but this is portions of Spring Street have that kind of more professional. Sometimes retail, sometimes residential, but in general, that sort of 0 to 10 foot maximum examples of buildings. And then as we look at Croton Avenue, the 10 foot, many of these are set back a little bit further. Here's an example here where they're set back a little bit further, but the maximum is typically around 20 feet for like a neighborhood storefront, something a little bit more more typical of Croton Avenue than it would be at Main Street. And then a number of areas throughout the downtown, but certainly along Croton Avenue have a stoop. This is just up the street from your village hall. And so the front yard setback here is a minimum of 10 feet, a maximum of 20. Another example here. So you can see there's some front yards in these conditions that make it slightly different. There are a number of streets. This is on Branderith. Some of these are on Broad Street. And so, the example here of having a full porch where almost the full width of the building is a porch. And so that's another typology that we want to allow and permit. And so part of what you're going to see, and the reason we just sort of included a couple of these diagrams, is that these diagrams are really, we're trying to sort of distill these typical conditions into a series of diagrams. And so it's the diagram that ends up showing up in the form-based code, not the photographs themselves. And so these are examples of similar conditions with stoops and storefronts. So here we're going to just focus in on one example, in your downtown core, in your village commercial district, the optional downtown overlay. And so this is a sort of a cropped in view of the regulating plan, sort of a draft of what it could look like for your downtown. And I want to draw your attention to these big, bold red lines here. And so here we have Main Street, here we have US 9, here we have Church Street, we have Croton Avenue coming off to the northeast here, and then Spring Street coming to the south here. And so in our opinion, when we looked at all of those existing conditions, looked at the sidewalks and the storefronts, the areas that are in bold red are the areas that we described as the primary commercial street frontage, those areas where storefronts are typical. Maybe there's a professional office use on the ground floor, but that basically the only thing that would be appropriate or permitted along these solid red areas would be either a storefront or that professional frontage. And we're looking at sort of the first floor as to what you see when you walk down the street. But in those cases, we would not allow for a park frontage or a stoop or a porch because they really don't belong in those locations. If we look a little further from the center at these kind of red dashed symbols, these secondary commercial street frontage, you know, portions of Spring Street as you get south of Waller Avenue, portions of Central Avenue, small portions of Main Street, portions of Church Street and the east side of US 9. Those are areas where it seems like, yes, you should allow and permit a storefront and the professional, but there may be conditions where a stoop or a porch may be appropriate. That form might be appropriate on the ground floor. But in this case, you would not service as where you would allow a loading dock or a parking lot or whatever. And, you know, for example, this gray line here represents the service street frontage. The back side of these parcels along Main Street, they're fronted on Central Avenue. Most of those are parking lots and loading docks. And so we want to allow for those conditions to happen, but want to be very careful where we allow loading docks and things like that to occur. And then the other one is this, you see, if you look on Branderith and look on portions of Leonard and portions of Broadway, the areas in blue, State, St. Paul's Place, and some of these side streets like Waller, that's where we've designated those as neighborhood street frontages, where we say, hey, these are perfectly appropriate for stoop or a porch, but not an appropriate place to put a storefront. And so, you know, if you lived or faced that street, you really wouldn't necessarily want to see a storefront in some of those locations. So I think the final one I'll highlight here is this green dashed line. It's a little harder to see here, but this Greenway street frontage is your Aqueduct Trail. And so the Greenway comes out to your park space here. And so these would encourage, some of these may be permitted, but in general, they're encouraging a strong landscape experience along that edge. And we'll need to work to define, the details of what's allowed in those locations there. So I think that sort of the basics that I wanted to make sure we introduced. I'll show you a few diagrams.
Hey Mark, so, this is Simon. Sorry to jump in for a second. I just, I know you're going to go into the different frontages in a little bit more detail right here. I thought this might be a good moment just to pause and make sure everyone's kind of followed along so far. If anyone has questions, not about the details, let's maybe wait till the end to talk about should it be X feet or Y feet. But if anyone has questions about terminology, or if you're not quite sure what Jonathan or Mark meant by different terms that they're using, this might be a time just to make sure that we've got everyone with us so far. I think this might be new for some folks. I just want to make sure everyone's following along.
My question is about, I guess, the walk on Saturday. We've talked about some of the specifics on these maps, and you've mentioned that some of these maps will be printed up and we'll be carrying them around and looking at them Saturday when we do the walk in this area that we're talking about in downtown. So I guess I just want to make sure, will that be an appropriate time for me to say, hey, I'm not so sure that what you've proposed as a neighborhood street frontage really should be limited to neighborhood street frontage. To me, that seems like it might make more sense to be a secondary commercial street frontage, and we'll be able to have that conversation on site.
Mayor, actually, you won't have the map you're looking at now. You won't have that. It's the two maps that Jonathan described earlier, which is our and Jonathan and Mark's view of what's a strong street frontage and comments on the different existing conditions. So you'll have an existing conditions maps with thoughts about it, which lead you to this type of map. But we wanted to get your input tonight before developing these what we call a regulating plan for downtown. You might want to, Mark, I don't mean to,
Yeah.
but you might want to go back to the 2 maps that Jonathan covered, just so the mayor sees them.
And Mayor, you know, to your point, I think these regulating plans, you know, we do need to go through a process of vetting what should they, you know, which streets are most appropriate for primary commercial, which ones are most appropriate for secondary commercial. These are, you know, up to interpretation, and obviously ultimately, you know, we're prepared to make some recommendations, but it certainly may need to be refined as we go.
Yeah, these are the 2 maps, Mayor, the existing conditions for downtown, and thoughts from Jonathan and Mark on the existing conditions. But as Mark said, these are going to set, these existing conditions set the basis for the form-based code. And then the second map here is to do Croton Avenue in the same way. We did these simply because, remember our waterfront walk, we just wanted people to have some, a map for downtown and a map for Croton Avenue to make notes on or so on. But at a later point, we, because we haven't, I think we haven't quite completed everything yet, we wanted to get your input this evening, and then Jonathan and Mark would, you know, follow up and make completed maps of recommendations for downtown.
Okay. Would it be possible to include a map of what we were looking at just previously? Because if we're talking about, you know, the existing conditions and how that would translate into potentially the different districts of commercial versus secondary versus neighborhood, I feel like we'll do half the conversation and then, you know, but we may not get to specific, you know, like I personally think secondary business should be permitted all the way up to Broad Avenue, up both State and Spring. But I think that right now I'd like to be able to have that conversation with you when we're there. And I don't know if something else will come up, but those are things that jumped out at me while you were talking today.
Yeah, we can try. To tell you the truth, we made copies of these maps just today, but actually Sylvia, who you know, is in the office tomorrow. We can try to make. I don't want to promise it for.
Yeah, I don't. You know. Instead of creating more paper, if this is going to be available to us electronically, then I can just look at it while we're there. I'm just telegraphing. Maybe I'm just telegraphing my question. I just want to be able to have that conversation when we're in the field. That's right. It, rather than going into detail now, because you know, I may be imagining something that when we're there, I'll see it differently. So then the one other question I had is, you did that really helpful conditions page on the frontage with the different pictures of existing buildings. Yeah, I think you're probably getting to it. Yeah, and so then when you get the next one where you show on the bottom row, like what that looks like, those are really helpful for understanding frontage. One question I'm going to have when we talk about the overlay zone and the incentives for height. Right now, I don't think we have, oh yeah, so this is one. Yeah, so the 147 Main Street, which is the infill right across from Market Square, that's a 5-story building. That's one of the only 5-story buildings in downtown right now. So I don't think that there are very many buildings that are similar height. And I don't remember the specifics of how that was incentivized and permitted. That was built my first year on the board, and most of the negotiations had happened before that. We do have some buildings that are what we now have as of right, which is commercial, mixed use commercial with 3 stories of residential on top. I can picture one for sure that exists like that on Spring Street. So one of the questions that I would be asking when we're talking about incentives for these overlay zones is, are we starting at the right point for with as of right as 4 stories with incentivizing 5 stories? Or should we consider as of right as 3 stories, which is actually what exists most places as the max with few exceptions, and then incentivizing 4 stories? So that's one of the questions I'll have. And you guys did such a great analysis here with the frontage types. I was hoping that you would then do height types, and we would be looking at buildings around and I think that type of height is more likely to be considered for downtown than Croton Avenue, but I'm not sure what you would be recommending. So those are the questions that have come up right now. I love what you're doing. I could sit around and talk all day, but I'm going to stop talking now and look and wait to hear what others have to say.
But
Sorry, go ahead, Benny.
sorry, no, thank you. I mean, if anything, I'll be able to print that a 24 by 36 map that you were talking about, Victoria, and I think it would be useful for us to have something big so we can actually look at it. So if you send me that, I can print it out here for Saturday. That being said, so you know, I guess Mark, my question to you is, and probably for Jonathan and Frank, because we are talking about existing conditions. Sure, we are talking about you know, buildings that are there now.
Yes.
So looking at the form-based code and looking at the potential or recommended setbacks that we have in relationship to where, you know, I want to call it a buffer zone from the property line to a new development. If I'm looking at the downtown and I'm looking at portions of Croton Avenue, there's not that many opportunities of new buildings in there. So are we addressing, do we want to address this? You know, obviously that could definitely work. I can see that working in New York Shell. And New York City has been kind of working with this type of form-based code for many years now. You know, and how they deal with setbacks as they progress within a height and everything else in there. But here, you know, if I'm looking at downtown, unless they're doing an addition in an existing building, how do we justify, you know, don't get me wrong, I like form-based codes. I think it's great in a lot of different concepts. I've done, and I have talked to people in Portchester that like it. They like what they have done. I've spoken to people in Monquisco. Just my concern is, you know, to me, this works in Market Square, let's say, or the empty parking lot that we have across the street right to the post office. It works on portions of Croton Avenue where, you know, there's a potential to do something in there and empty lots, but I just don't, you know, please, and I could be wrong, please explain to me how it'll work in an existing condition.
I think one of the items that a number of the downtowns that we've worked in the past have the same provisions that you have in your downtown commercial area, where residential uses are only permitted above a commercial use. And I will say in most situations, the cost premiums to put a residential use on top of a commercial use are often so prohibitive that redevelopment doesn't happen. So, you know, as an example, there may be, you know, in our contracting retail market where we have sort of, you know, less and less demand for having certain kinds of commercial, having flexible uses on the ground floor. There may be certain areas of Main Street or Croton Avenue where the first 40 feet must be commercial. But if the property's 200 feet deep, it is far more market responsive to say, if the back 60 feet or 80 feet or 100 feet of that, you know, 100 feet of that property were to allow a residential use on the ground floor, it might actually be more market responsive. And if one of your goals is to promote reinvestment, many of the property owners that may not have been able to afford to put 20,000 square feet of commercial on the ground floor and then put 20,000 square feet of residential above, I think that's an area where you could expect applicants opting into this overlay, because right now the residential is prohibited on the ground floor. And so I think it may come to
just give me 1 minute, please. Thank you, Mark, and that's helpful. So if you were to go back to the sort of, I want to say the last map where you were talking about that one right there, no, the one before that, that one right there. So the primary use that you were talking about, the frontage, is, if I'm looking at the downtown, is Main Street, parts of Spring Street, St. Paul, and a little bit of across the street from Waller, sure, and then parts of Church Street. We already have that. You know, the commercial part. You know, we have part of the commercial and the retail, and we have residential on some of them, not all of them, on some of that already. So, you know, how is that? And I don't see, you know, obviously as a village, you know, we want to try to maintain the character of a village. We don't, me personally, I don't want to become, you know, New Rochelle. I don't want to become Yonkers. You know, I do not, I'm not opposed to development, but I think I want to make sure that, you know, my concern is how do we make this work to what we have? Because portions of this, you know, if we were to go to a form-based code, if let's say we do all these things, if a new developer comes in and says, look, I want to do this, and we are meeting all the categories that you stated in form-based code, they don't have to go in front of the zoning board to get a variance for, you know, front yard, you know, side yards, or even parking at that point, you know. But that's what I think when we start getting to a little bit more of the details, I want to understand that better. What does that look like? You know, why do we, you know, because it's a trade-off, sure. How much do we do for this and how much do we do for that? You know, one of the biggest drawbacks and probably some of that stuff we're going to be seeing hopefully by the end of the year, beginning of next year, is parking. So what does that look like for us? You know, so I think a lot of, as much as, you know, I would like to be, I'm a supporter of form-based codes, you know, I want to understand all these other additional elements and layers that go with this. So, but that's something I guess that we can talk a little bit more in detail, but this is very helpful. I do appreciate all this stuff. I'm learning a lot on this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Manny, I think Mark is going to go into some of those details. Might answer some.
I have five.
But just to, you know, in respect to what you are asking, I was thinking that the point that you're making is, you know, those existing buildings and so forth, and as we're talking about it as an overlay, those existing buildings can continue. They can remain. However, if you did have a property, and if you look on the corner of St. Paul's and Spring Street, you know, as that property was developed under your existing zoning, it was throughout whatever the process was, it was deemed it was okay to put a parking lot right on the corner of what I would consider as a really, really important corner in your downtown. So the form-based code, you know, would allow people, would require a different type of frontage along there. In this instance, at a first draft here, Mark is suggesting that it would be a primary frontage. But there are other instances, and you can see that beginning a little further south on Spring Street, where you get a bit more flexibility. And I think Mark was talking about that, you know, again, if that property doesn't want to do anything, they're okay. They don't become non-conforming. They stay as they are. But if they start to look and say, you know what, I'd like to sort of redevelop this site, and I'd like to do so under the existing zoning, then that person is really looking at the only thing that's on the ground floor will have to be commercial or retail, right? Under the existing zoning. And one of the things that, you know, we're looking at here is sort of the reality of, as Mark was mentioning, that contracting retail market, and probably the very heavy lift that a particular property owner would say, you know what, I can't do that. I just cannot put 20 or 25,000. I can't expect to rent that. The form-based code, at least in the secondary frontage, would give a bit more flexibility. So you could still have a portion of that as a retail, but you might also have sort of a residential lobby entrance or a forecourt or something like that. That flexibility is not currently available in your code. And so that developer would then have to go before the ZBA and through this long process. And I think what we're trying to do, and I'm not saying we have it right, the mayor was bringing up some great points here, like, hey, let's look at these frontages a little bit closer. But what we're trying to do here is build in a little bit more of that flexibility, but, you know, book in that flexibility, if you will, and say, look, here's what you can do here, because we've sort of all decided this is what's going to work. But it's not just a one size fits all that everybody has to do commercial in this massive swath, I would say, of your downtown. The other thing that I would add to that is the, you know, the fine detail and the bit more diversity of frontages will contribute, I think, contributes richly to downtown. And finally, this idea of allowing residential more easily in the downtown, I think, is a very strong plus, especially given the retail conditions, and especially given the fact that having more people, you know, sort of as patrons living, you know, making that downtown sort of a living environment would be a very positive thing. And I think that's sort of where we're coming at. We're not saying that this is going to encourage development everywhere. There's the existing zoning remains and protects existing property owners. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Maybe I could suggest that Mark has only about 5 more, I think a half dozen, just quick slides. If we could show those, we could kind of give you a big picture.
Thank you. And Jonathan, that parking lot is actually village-owned parking lot, so.
Well, you guys can do something about that immediately.
Yep. I'll move quickly here because I think it's really important that we have a robust conversation. I think this is really important because it's important we all get engaged in. This is a tool. It's a tool to serve the character of what you want the standards to be in your downtown, and what you want the standards to be in Croton Avenue. This is a tool to achieve those ends. So we can customize this to meet those needs. So the diagrams that we identify for each of these frontage types, showing sort of storefronts as a frontage type, and showing some minimum amount of glazing. Maybe there's 60 or certain amount of glass. A blank wall doesn't make for a storefront, so we need to have some minimum amount of glass along the street. And here are examples along in your downtown where that kind of frontage exists. The professional frontage where the windows could be slightly smaller, where the it could be more of an office setting and maybe a little bit less of a true storefront retail environment could exist. And there's one other typology here, that sort of stoop frontage, a situation where you would allow the building to be 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet above the sidewalk would be a permissible condition there. And the other key element of this is that creating dynamic downtown environments and creating vibrant streets sometimes needs a place where you can have programmed activities, where you can have an amphitheater, where you can have a band or a concert or a choral event, or and you have those civic spaces right now at the corner of Main and Spring, but right now they're surrounded by parking lots. And so with the right fine tuning of this code and these standards, we could identify where certain kinds of frontages might open onto those civic spaces. So you could have a restaurant or a public space or some sort of a semi-public environment opening onto those green spaces. And so those civic spaces could be small, like a pocket park. They could be narrow, like a pedestrian way. They could be a corner green, a larger square, or in the case of what you have right now, sort of a greenway. Those are things where we would permit and promote creating those, and allowing those things to happen. And in the case of a very large site, we may want to require, if somebody has, more than half an acre or more than some amount of site, where we say, hey, you should at least have a pocket park or at least have some sort of civic space as a part of a land development, if there were to be a large site redeveloped, that there would be some degree of civic space required. So that's, to be determined, and maybe that's one of the target uses for the community benefit fund. Maybe it helps fund some of the improvements to these areas. And I think this is my last, almost my last slide here. I just want to sort of zoom in a little bit and just sort of say, clearly you have in front of your post office, you have a number of parking areas where, with some refinement and fine tuning, we could work with you to identify the right combinations of incentives and forms. And one of the ideas, just picking up on your comment, Mayor, this notion that many of the areas in the downtown are 3 stories, maybe 4, 5 is clearly the exception, not the norm. There may be areas where we say that something we call a step back, this notion to say, maybe you go up 3 stories, and if you're going to have that extra story, maybe it's set back 8 feet or something, so that it is a good neighbor to the neighboring properties, where, if most of these buildings here are 3 or 4 stories, maybe that cornice line at 45 feet or some number is set. And, if there was an additional floor allowed, it might be stepped back a couple feet from the sidewalk and would be a better neighbor to the adjoining properties. The other thing that we sort of talked about was some notion that there, maybe residential uses could or should be permitted on the first floor. Certain areas, they may be appropriate to be on the first floor anywhere, and certain streets, maybe they're only on the first floor if they're more than 40 feet back from the sidewalk environment. So just a couple, those are things that we're going to explore together. Hopefully, most of these, key concepts have come across. In the end, this form-based overlay is about reinforcing the high quality buildings and street experiences you have right now, and sort of making sure that those patterns, those forms, those sidewalk conditions, those civic spaces, those storefronts and building facades are good neighbors to each other and create an even stronger sense of identity and place in your downtown and along Croton Avenue. So I open it up to any other questions that we have.
I think we have just a concluding slide or two, right?
Yes, we do. Yep.
Why don't I do the,
is it okay?
Sorry.
I just want to ask one question just before you go too much further. Mark, when you were talking about the incentives and doing setbacks for height, how important will the height be in considering, in incentivizing development that's cost effective and viable?
There are fire codes and building codes make building new construction of one kind of use on top of another kind of use. For example, when you're trying to put a residential use on top of a commercial use, the structural grids of a commercial ground floor space are invariably entirely different than a residential structural grid. The mechanical systems are entirely different. The chases, where if you had a restaurant with a vent hood going up. So the bottom line is, there are many kinds of buildings that we see built from the 1890s and 1860s and 1920s that may have been cost effective in 1920 before fire codes were what they were today. So I think there's many kinds of examples of where municipalities pass zoning ordinances to say, only 3 stories. Well, if you had 2 stories of residential on top of 1 story of commercial, you will find very, very, very few examples across the country of where it's economically viable to build 2 stories of residential on top of 1 story of commercial. You will find that at least 3 stories of residential is often required to make the pro forma numbers work for economically viable development. And so, so I think that it is a key consideration in terms of understanding what is a market viable alternative.
Okay. And then I'm just going to take this slide and next you just provide a little bit of a conclusion and a transition over to question, just to a discussion period. But we wanted to say, how does this get implemented? And we hope that this will build on the village's design guidelines. In other words, we would like to keep using Steve Tilley's design guidelines, and I'll get to that at this last dot point. We're hoping too that the form-based code will streamline a little bit the review process so that you get the right forms sort of predicted in the code so that there's not arguments over them as much. One of the ideas of form-based, if it works right, is to streamline the review process, and for the developer and actually for the residents to make sure that you know what is expected in the code. It better signals to everyone what is expected, so it's more predictable. It creates a more predictable code. And then the decision-making for details still would remain, in our view, with the planning board in site plan review, so that there's where Steve Tilley's design guidelines can come into play. Once the form-based code sets the overall building envelope, if you will, then Steve Tilley's design guidelines can still be applied by the planning board. And Mark, I think we have just next steps here. What we were hoping to do, a couple of things, is that we would be working with Jaime Martinez and Stuart on a little bit on the T zone improvements and this new multifamily lower density text, and get those to you along with a form-based draft, so that, as the mayor said, you want to actually see it and have it. We find that, you know, it's great to have a discussion like tonight. We need to get your input, but I find you really do need the things in your hands so that you can see them and examine them. And I think after tonight, we'd like to get you these three products with you. So submit a zoning package to you in early October. I think that, Karen, if I'm right, Maddie and you suggested maybe a future working session with the trustees on the 28th. Our thought is to get a zoning package to you early in October and then have another session like this perhaps on the 28th. So that's the sort of big picture next steps that we had in mind, other than, of course, Saturday. And we'll try to respond and get tomorrow electronically the map that, Mayor, you mentioned you're interested in, that Mark was discussing later on in the slides. So with that, I think we can turn it back to the trustees, or to you, Mayor.
Well, there's so many people on this this call that I'd like to hear from. I have pages of questions, but I will, since you gave me the...
Could we switch out of full screen mode and go to gallery so we can see each other?
Good. Thank you for doing that. But I just lost everything I'm looking at. Oh, no, I'm looking at your screen. It's just blue for everyone. Well, I'll ask my question while you're getting that up.
Well, could you just unshare your screen? There you go.
There we go. That's better.
I did want to ask the overlay zone. You mentioned there's a couple of neighborhood center zones. I think it was on Camp Woods and then further up on Route 9 that are part of that same existing zoning code, but you were not including them with the recommended overlay zone. Why not? Does it need to be contiguous?
Yeah, Mayor, maybe I should start from, go back a little bit. Actually, what's in the RFP was to just do the form-based zone for downtown, for your current village center. So that was what we responded to, of course, and is in our contract. you had made a good suggestion. We took it. You had suggested to us some months ago that we also include Croton Avenue. So now spent the time looking at Croton Avenue and having a slightly different approach to Croton Avenue. I think, as Mark said, we find the other districts a little bit different than these two major districts, and we're not sure that they need the same form-based approach. So that was our thinking, that we wanted to at least get a package to you that you could digest and focus on first, at least in terms of downtown.
Okay, we'll take a look at it. I guess those are areas that that need some help. So maybe what we'll be able to do once we have a clear idea of how we might have an overlay zone for the neighborhood center areas of Croton Avenue, then we can just take all that we're learning from you and the recommendations and see how they might apply to the rest of the neighborhood center area. You'll be providing this online for us to look at the whole slideshow, because one of the slides went by too fast and I just looked away for a second and then it was gone. So, but that's fine. I can look at it, and I'm just so excited about so many of the things that you're suggesting. One just last simple question that I'll ask, and then I really want to hear from everybody else, is with the civic spaces in downtown. I assume that, as you know, those, as you pointed out, it's a bunch of parking lots next to our beautiful public gathering spaces. And ideally that will look different someday. I had hoped that would happen by now, but someday it might look different. And I assume when that's the case, that the actual lines and the parameters of where those spaces are adaptable as the village sees fit when we invite developers to come in. Some may get bigger, some may get smaller. Okay, all right, then that was it. And, I'm going to turn my mic off and look forward to hearing from other trustees and members of all these committees and land use boards who've joined us. Like Rika,
we have a lot of speakers.
Rika, did you want to say something? I see you turned your mic on.
Oh, yeah, you know, I've been listening to it. I've been moving around, so you've been watching like my background, I guess. This was really helpful. I think the invitation for this meeting was not a presentation, but a tutorial on a certain type of zoning, which I thought was really, really helpful. Not so sure about next steps, because I didn't think that's what I was coming to. I was coming to learn about form-based zoning and not a presentation to move something forward. So I would just put a question mark next to that. I don't really need an answer. I think this is terrific. As the slides were going by me, you know, it's really interesting to listen to architects and architecture conversations, and clearly very experienced conversation. Clearly lots of thought went into different designs, and the discussion that I found a golden nugget, which if I get one golden nugget out of any 2-hour conversation, I think it's the winner conversation, to be honest. It's fantastic. The golden nugget that I got was how much of codes and zoning, which are two different things, but in both cases, is about the inside of buildings. Sometimes if they're big enough, it also includes some of the outside, but it's really just about what the developer owns, and not about being good neighbors. And people have heard me say this. So this is the first presentation / tutorial that I've heard where there was a lot of conversations with using human words, like buildings should be good citizens. It's about the community. It's about how one thing goes into another. So for me, the thoughtfulness is really helpful. I would like to focus in my role, not as a taxpayer for all these many years, but as a representative of public, is to talk about human beings and people and not buildings. So as this conversation went on, in my head, you know, sort of the voice in my head was, so what? Really? So what? So you build more and we'll have to have more services, and we'll make more to get more taxes, and we'll have to have more staff, and we'll have to have more of this and more of that and more kids in the school. So for me, it's a lot about answering in these conversations, the so what. What does it do for the people of this community? Is it that we want to attract more people? And I thought about it specifically when you kept talking about retail, because retail in the 21st century America is a dying organism. It has nothing to do with villages and the beauty of villages and architecture. It has something to do with the internet, and it has something to do with where US economy is moving. Some of the most beautiful, well thought out communities are dying on the vine, and it's not just COVID, it was happening before. So I would be really more interested in understanding how this helps the people of our community. What is the goal here? To build retail space is great if retail was a growing economic engine. To build a downtown that may be only pedestrian, as some communities around the world have done, to attract people on the weekends, for example, because it's more of a touristy place. Hey, let's go for a cup of coffee, therefore shutting down streets. Forget just the sidewalks spill into the street. I'm very interested in the goals. So that would be like a part 2 thought process for me, because at the end of the day, it's not about buildings, and it's not, Mount Kisco spent, I don't know how many years, entirely redoing Mount Kisco from an old looking town. It's not a river town. And when you drive there now, and when you drove there even before COVID, I don't know if 50% of the stores are shut down, but it's a pretty big number. And they planned for the immediate future. They didn't really plan for the future and for flexibility. So I was listening sort of with that in my mind. It's about people, not buildings. It's not about beauty, it's about functionality. And if we already have a pretty built out downtown, might we want to look at areas that are not built out, like Upper Croton, where there is more property and more opportunity? It's not so much a question as a comment about every slide should have a so what on the bottom of it. For me, personally, and the so what has to be about human beings. And by the way, I have no doubt that this is all about human beings. It just didn't come off the pages for me as how does this make things better? Switching over Burger King to McDonald's changes absolutely nothing except for the companies. It changes nothing. It's just a different name with a different building. How does it make it better? And I didn't get that from this presentation. I got a lot of things from it. I'd really be interested in that conversation.
I mean, I think my initial thought on that is that the vibrancy of community and civic life in a downtown often has to do with access and transparency and close proximity. And so I think one of the underlying objectives that I think our team has been discussing is ways in which we can identify where should there be ground floor transparency and access and connectivity that is allowed to be more flexible and more organic to connect people together. And so unfortunately, sometimes historic Euclidean zoning is all about separating uses. Only commercial things can happen here and only industrial things can happen here, but only residential things can happen here. And so I think right now, I'm a visitor to your community. I see a separation where only certain commercial things can happen here and only certain residential things can happen here. And I think the evolution of that, breaking down the barriers, 100 years ago, you probably didn't have zoning that says only commercial can happen here and only residential can happen here. I think we're probably hopefully returning to a place where that organic activity of people coming together without worrying about whether many of the communities we're working in, there's a list of 200 permitted uses. And if you don't have the right kind of nail salon or the right kind of dentist or the right kind of whatever, you're not allowed to be in the downtown, or you're not allowed to be in that building. And so it leaves property owners frustrated if they're unable to transform their properties with the market. So
I would just add to that too. I don't know if there's certain things that maybe we weren't clear enough on too. We're trying also to make it easier for downtown to accept, if you will, if a developer or an owner wanted to do that residential, to make it an easier process and a clearer roadmap, because we realize, and have been experiencing in other communities, that retail is a declining market. So that we want to allow flexibility in the code to have what is the strongest market right now, not to preclude retail, but to provide for other uses downtown. And getting residents, we've always found getting people to live downtown really makes for a more vibrant, downtown, and helps the retailers who are able to survive. So that is one underlying goal of this, which we hope will, help Ossining in terms of maintaining a vibrancy to its downtown.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about form-based zone in general is that, a lot of the historical properties, as was just mentioned by Mark, were built during a time where there was much more concern about the form of that property than there was about the use of that property. And there was one slide in particular that you had, I think it was 4 or 5 slides in, where you showed Main Street sort of looking 2 different directions, but on opposite sides of the street. And I think that a lot of what you've put together here really kind of conveys that desire to bring that sort of feel back to Main Street on the east side of Main Street.
Agree.
Which was lost during urban renewal.
Yeah.
So I think that, I think that is something that would be, that a lot of people have expressed the concern about the impact of urban renewal and how it sort of took away half of Main Street. So focusing on the form and creating a zoning that allows for that, I think, is something that a lot of people have conveyed is desirable. I think, figuring out at the margins, the heights and everything else are the questions, but bringing back that walking feel is part of what, is the charm, that if you're looking one direction on Main Street, the charm of Ossining is wonderful. And if you're looking at the other side, you can tell that something is missing.
If I may, I agree with what Jaime just said completely. They didn't do urban renewal, they did urban removal. And they just ripped it all out with no thought to what was happening next. Well, we've come to a new place in the world. The nature of work is changing. Retail, as we all know, is going away. And what's replacing it is unsure. So I think we have to have a conceptual conversation on what we see goes on the ground floors of buildings. Perhaps the concept that a number of places like Beacon have used, where you have work-live spaces for craftspeople, craft breweries. There was a wonderful glass blowing factory where the workers live upstairs. The idea of bringing jobs that won't be replaced by the internet because you're making the goods. Light manufacturing and artist lofts seem to be a way to go that will help. People in Austin need jobs, and so many jobs are gone forever, or when they come back, they're going to look entirely different. I was in the television production industry, and as a result of COVID, it's being automated to the point where when this is over, there'll be 25% of the people that used to work in television production. The other 75% I don't know. How many places can you work and say, hey, babe, you want fries with that? We need to find a way to integrate development with providing jobs, and providing jobs in a way that make Ossining a destination. That's my thought on this. And I think that Mark's presentation about this changing the way and look at zoning is a step in that direction. Thank you so much for what you shared with us this evening. It's been very enlightening, and it's a really good first step. But I ask that going forward, we take into account that we need to provide jobs for people who live here so that you can live and work in the same community, and that the jobs you have bring people here, that they want to see what we do and buy what we make. Thanks.
One of the evolutions that we've seen in a lot of downtowns, to your point, Bob, about jobs, is artisan production. You know, if it's 20 people making donuts or making pastries or making some craft or making some wood product or some craft, it's not industrial. I think artisan production and being flexible in how we allow for creative doers and makers to coexist in the middle of a downtown is a good thing, and something we should find ways to encourage.
I'm only going to ask one more thing, because I don't, there's so many people on the call, but Bob had said something that I thought was sort of brilliant, so thanks, Bob. But in your presentation or anywhere in this, is there room and conversation of bringing something across Route 9 that is walkable to connect the two parts of our community, and to make it easier for people from the high school to walk to the community center, to come downtown without putting their life in their hand trying to run across Route 9? I mean, a walkway going, a bridge across or something. Is there a conversation about bringing the two, upper and lower, if you will, together? I just didn't see it. I don't know if that's been discussed. Just asking a question.
Yes.
Trustee, I'm going to try to answer this question. While the zoning here, I think that they've talked about really doesn't totally connect to that, the study that we are about to embark on with Nelson Nygaard does directly connect to that and will be integrated into the comp plan. Some of the results and findings of that, which will be tied in, directly to that zoning. So that is forthcoming, but not from BFJ.
Okay, thank you.
We are, Rika, hoping, we suggested to Karen and Maddie that as they get underway, Nelson Nygaard, that we meet with them, so we coordinate our work with theirs.
Again, thank you.
I'll go. Thanks everybody for the thoughtful presentation. High quality as always. So I'll start with, if you were to rank everybody on this call in terms of expertise, I would not only be toward the bottom, but probably at the very bottom of expertise. Yes, Jaime, yes. At the very bottom. So I'm prefacing everything that I say with that. I come to you with a lot of humility. I barely know what I'm talking about. So take that into consideration with everything that I'm about to say. So we've mentioned Nelson Nygaard, and one of the adages that they have around their parts is that transportation should be a means to an end, not an end unto itself. And when it comes to this kind of change to form-based codes, one of the pieces that I'm thinking about is who's not at the table right now. And one of the pieces that I know that in part of the larger conversation is involved, but it's not at the table right now, are engineers, like really technical, specific people. And these are people that I'm, my sense is that when we're moving toward prioritizing design above these kind of classical technical constraints, they feel some type of way, in the way that folks at Apple, I'm sure, felt when it came to Steve Jobs saying, you know, make something that's this big, that's a phone, that's a this and that and a whatever. So my question is, what are the voices that are maybe not at the table now that are important to involve from a technical perspective?
I think on the, I think one thing that Jaime said is important in answer to Rinka's question, and that is, I think that the form-based code doesn't exist in a vacuum. In other words, your streets, how they function, and the pedestrian system, which Nelson Nygaard is going to be looking at with engineers here, Omar. That engineering input would be good to inform some of, not all of, but some of the form-based code. For instance, the two large parking lots downtown, Market Square and Post Office. One thing we've been looking at, is Jaime raised, is are the sidewalks downtown wide enough? We looked at it. We think that they compare the 10-foot to 12-foot width, you know, compares pretty well with some of the other downtowns of Westchester, you know, Scarsdale, Bronxville, but you have an opportunity to create wider sidewalks where you have newer buildings going in. And those two sites, the form-based code could get us an additional setback big enough so you could have, you know, an outdoor dining, one of the slides that Mark showed, for instance. That combination of streetscape, lighting, of about 5 feet, then your sidewalk of about 10, and then you've got outdoor dining. I mean, you need like 15 to 20 feet, not 10 to 12. 10 to 12 is pretty standard, you have it, but there's some opportunities like that where you can combine that with what Nelson Nygaard might recommend in terms of crosswalks, how they do the crosswalks, particularly on Route 9, and trying to connect east and west on Route 9. That'll be very important.
One of the reasons that I mentioned that the front lot line sometimes does not coincide with the build-to line is that sometimes the existing condition just isn't enough. You know, the sidewalk is 5 feet when it should be 15. And so I think in general, coordinating with that whole streetscape effort to make sure that the front build-to line is appropriately deep for that condition is certainly an area where we should be coordinating and cooperating. I think one of the other considerations that we should all be thinking about is dimensions of efficient parking lots. And there are, I've heard more than a little conversation about the need for conveniently placed parking in the downtown core. Hopefully not, you know, continuing to have all the parking sit at the corner of Spring and Main. And so parking garage design is something that we've tried to at least be considering, you know, in terms of thinking about how deep, how the ramps work, how far back it should be set from the sidewalk to make for a vibrant street. So I think, you know, parking design is certainly one of the layers that should be a consideration as we craft the code and making sure that we put away from the street, but maybe not too much. So I think there's definitely going to need to be some fine tuning of that with you know, other voices.
Thank you. My second and last question is I'd love to hear your thoughts about change management. So Ossining is a community, like many others, that has had historically some challenges when it comes to making large changes. And I don't know who the potential short-term or long-term winners and losers are of change to form-based codes, and whether you can mitigate some of the people who are going to be losing, whether it's individual people or like types of people that are going to most be, and I say losing in like the large order term. How are you going to educate the public generally, but also the people that are going to be impacted the most about this change?
Well, Omar, one thing we hope, or we found in the past, it's the overlay as a concept is not a new concept in zoning, but the overlay for a form-based and an opt-in provision by the property owner is relatively recent, and we found it's been working fairly well. In terms of change management, it says to the person who's hesitant and really doesn't want to participate, they don't have to. But it says to the person who's perhaps, you know, sees an opportunity, sees something that can that they feel will enhance downtown and help what they're doing, their property. They will be able to have an incentive, we hope, to do that, and it will make things more predictable for them, and hopefully it will be an easier, you know, approval process. So I think for those who want to, that change management idea will be participatory. But for those who don't, they don't have to fear. You know, I find sometimes at public hearings where there's a view that government is imposing something, that people don't have a choice about it. That creates fear, and it creates resistance. So I think we're trying to avoid that by giving that opt-in provision, by making this, if you will, voluntary.
Thank you. That's it for me.
I see that it is just 10 minutes to 9, and there are so many people that we haven't gotten to hear from. I just want to make sure if there's anybody, I'm not seeing anything in the chat room. There were a couple things earlier of simple questions. Is there anybody from the Comp Plan Steering Committee or any of our land use boards or other volunteers who have questions that they want to ask before 9 o'clock, when I think we probably need to move on to what's next in our personal lives, hopefully?
Yes.
This is Pat. I've got one. First of all, just thanks a lot for the information. There were two questions specifically. Really appreciate it. There's, a lot of detail for me. It's also a novice, and the whole details and minutia from a zoning perspective. So the information is great. So one is kind of a request in terms of sharing the presentation. Is it going to be shared and relatively quickly so that we can?
We can send it, I think, tomorrow.
Okay.
Should we send Karen? Should we just send it to you, or Maddie? We can send it to.
That would be great.
Yeah, great, terrific.
Yeah, we'll make sure it gets out.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then my question is, to a little along the lines of the same thing as you, Mayor, and your question around, and so specifically it says, I know the scope was specifically to look at Croton Avenue and kind of like the downtown area, but based off of what you've seen from a town perspective in our village, where else would this potentially be impactful? And for me, and the way I'm thinking about it is, there's definitely a certain set of existing structures where, probably not a lot's going to be done. There is some space available and some structures where, there could be some redevelopment possibilities. And then there are also some other places outside of what we've talked about tonight where there's more space, right? Potentially, for me, I'm thinking, one, the waterfront area, two, what I think we're talking about, like the southern entry into, along South Island and then North Island, where there's a fair amount of space. But there's some space potentially for development, and places where people have torn down buildings to get ready for development, where, having something in place could have a significant impact over potential development over the next couple of years, right? So from my perspective, there's an intersection where form-based overlay, has more potential impact, where there's going to be more potential, kind of or opportunity or space for development. So based off of what you've seen, you know, where else might, from your perspective, might that be, right? And that's a question to, you know.
Yeah. Part of the waterfront, you know, I think, Pat, part of the waterfront, maybe, we'd be hesitant to, well, as you know from our waterfront chapter and the discussion on that, we're hesitant to recommend anything. We have not recommended anything new on the east side of the tracks. We're you know, so I think it's, what I mean by that is new construction for residential. So I think a form-based code there may not be needed, because what we're looking at there with sea level rise, with the, you know, maps that we have, is trying to be very cognizant of that, maybe expanding open spaces, the parks. As you know, we've focused a little bit at Jaime's request on Angle Park. But on the west side, there's a whole little area there. I'm sorry, I misconstrued that. Change what I just said from the west. The west side would be the park side, the river side, sorry. And the east side, thank you, Pat, and the east side, the inland side. The inland side may be, there's a little mixed use kind of neighborhood area we see there that might be a place. And I think someone had chatted also North Highland Avenue. That's a possibility, except we see North Highland as what's up there now is just a little bit, I'm not saying a form-based couldn't work on North Highland. We just need to, we would need to investigate it a little bit. It's a different area. You've got Avalon up there. You've got major properties. The Dominican Sisters, I don't think they've gone through a whole own internal view of their property. I don't see that as, you could do something form-based there, but it might not, you know, have any impact. So we'd have to look at that at North Highland. But, and you may have, I'm sure between planning, between the committee, the different boards you have, there may be other areas which to do it. Our thought would be, if we can do something that we get a feel from the trustees of what's possible, for instance, for downtown to us, your 20, you know, 15, 16 efforts, your committee was right on downtown is where to focus first, and see if we can achieve that with something that you feel is the committee and the trustees feel is acceptable. Once that's in place, build on it, and then go to these other areas where you see possibilities.
Hold on, get off mute there. No, that's helpful, right? You know, I think I was thinking around, you know, and this is for a conversation for Saturday probably, but you know, people have recently taken down buildings right around the intersection of kind of Cedar and North Island, right? There are a couple of fairly broad open spaces there where, or they've cleared lots. There's a place where lots been cleared and stuff like that, where, you know, making sure that goes in the direction that is appropriate to me is also, you know, that's kind of what I was thinking specifically. Thanks.
Any final questions somebody wants to ask before the clock strikes 9 o'clock?
Not so much a question, but a comment. I just wanted to say thank you as well for the presentation, and also for, you know, a number of people that have talked about the importance of putting people in the middle of this, and the issue of making it work for this community. I think that's really important. And to that point, I just wanted to voice support for your multifamily 3 zone that you're talking about, because as part of the zoning board, you know, we've had a couple of cases recently looking for use variances where our hands are basically tied by the code. And it's not that what they're asking for is necessarily unreasonable at all, but, you know, and I've sat there and thought, really, this needs to be a change in the zoning, not, you know, providing a use variance. So I was really glad to see that in there.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Well, since that didn't require an answer, there is time for one super quick question or comment from anybody else before we say thank you. And Jaime, you want to wrap it up for us?
Well, Dana White has a comment that she asked about North Highland Avenue. I don't know if she wants to turn on her sound.
So you answered it, Jaime.
Oh, okay.
I just, North Highland is such a hodgepodge of like vacant lots and torn down gas stations, and especially as you go up past Snowden and all that. And I know that there's been long talk of the old furniture store that was A.L. Myers, and then Brandon, and that there's a big building back there of that becoming something. But I mean, I don't quite still understand why form-based zoning wouldn't work on North Highland, is because there aren't enough adjacent structures to each other, or why can't it work in a place other than, a denser area? I just don't understand. I'm just dense.
Well, no, I would just say quickly that it's just what you described. It doesn't have a sort of cohesive scale and design sense to it. So I'm not saying you couldn't do a form-based up there, but it's not as a clear-cut issue where you can pick up from your existing format. I think most people, we'll get a sense Saturday, I hope, in the tour, of what people like downtown. I think you have a wonderful, the bones of downtown to me in Austin. You have a very beautiful place, whereas North Highland would be different, so it would be a different approach. You could still do form-based zone there on North Highland, but
it would be a matter of, I do not know that area, so I can't speak to it particularly, but I would say, I think it's a matter of identifying where are there a similar scaled district, where are there similar scaled structures, could be somewhere elsewhere in the village that might serve as a model for coding, for determining what would be the right form, the right minimum, sort of build to zone, build to line, the right scale of structures, the right types of forms. And there certainly are examples where form-based codes can get involved into focusing on combining enhancements to sidewalks and the public frontage even more. So it could be an issue of enhancing both the sidewalk environment as well as the private frontage.
Well, it is now 9:02, so I'm gonna just wrap this up for us and thank everyone for participating. And I really look forward to seeing many of you Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Where are we meeting at 10 o'clock?
I think it's Village Hall.
Oh, okay, easy enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll see you there. And I just was going through a bunch of stuff in the office because I'm cleaning out and trying to make it nicey nice for Rika and everybody else to be able to have some more space in there. And I did come across that 2011 guidelines from Steve Tilley. So we have a nice hard copy of that in the village board office. And now I have much greater appreciation for the value of it, and we'll take a harder look at it. Thank you so much. This has been a really, really valuable tutorial. And I know I was the one who was asking for it since last year. And so you made my day by having this evening. Thanks so much. I learned a lot.
That'd be helpful.
Thanks, everybody.
See you guys. See many of you on Saturday.
See ya.
Bye. Touch to leave.